A massive, geeky breakdown on what the real value of NBA draft picks is. And I share it with you next on Locked On Jazz. It's a Locked On Jazz exclusive next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
How are you? I am David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA insider, and regular host of Locked On Jazz. Thanks so much. Leaf Tulane was great. I learned a ton. I listened to a bunch of the shows. It's kind of fun to wake up and listen to Locked On Jazz. I enjoyed it. Leaf will be back with you multiple times here between now and the draft. Frankly, he's better than I am heading into the draft, so we may figure out how to way to just integrate him a little bit more because he's just really good. Anyway, on today's show, I did a massive numbers geeky breakdown. I'll explain the methodology to you of the last 15 years or 14 years of NBA drafts in which players exist in our league. So back to the Kevin Durant, Jeff Green diff, and what every pick is worth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I will share it with you coming up here. And we will look at the system, what a pick yields, whether draft position matters, what the reality is after the 11th pick of the draft, what is a pick value, what is a bad draft. I can go through this and literally have this evaluation system shows you what a good draft is and a bad draft is. And so what does that tell us on if this is a supposed bad draft? And then we'll look at actually, I think the OG Anuaoby trade is super interesting by Toronto in the offseason, and I think the Gobert and Mitchell trades are interesting to look back at through this chart. So that's what we're going to do. As I mentioned, I'm David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA insider. This is Locked On Jazz. It's a daily podcast on the Utah Jazz, giving you insight, expertise, today, geeky numbers, and hopefully making it way better to be a Jazz fan each and every day. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jazz your first listen of the day. Thank you, everydayers. You're the best. We are free and available on all podcasting apps as well as on YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side. I'm a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on the classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now, free on the App Store or Google Play. All right, here's what I did. I went through the last 14 NBA drafts, back to the 2007, and I started in 2020. The 2021 draft, when I started to look at it, I just don't think we know yet. Okay, so that's a little bit. You can't evaluate a draft until we know. So the 2021 draft is Cade Cunningham, Jalen Green, Evan Mobley, Scotty Barnes, Josh Giddey, Jonathan Kuminga, Franz Wagner. Really good draft. I think we know, but I can't really tell you right now where I think Jalen Green is on that scale or where I think Scotty Barnes is or Jalen Suggs. I need another year to be able to evaluate kind of where they are and who they are as players, which tells you a lot about this in the process. So I started in the 2020 draft, which is the Anthony Edwards, James Wiseman, LaMelo Ball, Patrick Williams, Isaac Okoro, Okongwu, Killian Hayes, Obi Toppin, Denny Advada, Jalen Smith draft. Here's how I judged players. Okay, so this is the key to the whole thing that you have to understand if you're going to follow this process. So here is how players were valued. A MVP pick. So one of the 10 players in the MVP in the league every year, and this goes, by the way, to our whole entire system that we've talked about all year long on what the Jazz need to build. And what you need to build is you need a top 10 player. You need a top 20 player, right? You need a top 50 player. And then, frankly, from thereafter, without being too, snippet about it, you can go find those other guys. Getting a top 10 player, virtually impossible. Getting a top 20 player, virtually impossible. I mean, right now, I just don't think there's a single top 20 player or a top 50 or top 10 player that's going to be available to the Jazz. They want to go find a starter, they can go find a starter. And then from there, so I weighed them differently. It's not the same thing like if a player hits and he's an MVP. So 10 points for an MVP, 7 points for a top 20 player, 5 points for a top 50 player, 3 points for a starter, 2 points for a rotation player, 1 for a borderline kind of in and out rotation player. Okay? That's the system. So if we go 2020, let me just give you can grasp it. And I've gone through it. I think it's close. So Anthony Edwards is a 10. He's an MVP caliber player. James Wiseman is a 0. I didn't even give him a 1 for borderline right now. I gave him a 0. LaMelo Ball, who I think probably is close to a top 50 right now, is just a starter. I could change that, give him a top 50. Fair. Patrick Williams, 4th pick of the draft, is a starter, a 3. Isaac Okoro is a rotation player. He gets a 2. Neku Okongwu is a starter. He gets a 3. Killian Hayes is a 0. It's over. Like, he's played for 4 years. He's shot 38% from 3. He's getting a 0. Obi Toppin is a rotation player. He gets a 2. Denny Advada, the 9th pick of the draft, is a starter. Might turn out to be a top 50 player, actually. But as of right, Jalen Smith has been a borderline. David Vassell at 11 is a starter. Could be a 50. I might be a little low on that. Tyrese Halliburton is a top 20 player in the NBA at 12, so he gets 7. Kyra Lewis is a 0. Aaron Nesmith is a starter with a 3. Cole Anthony is a rotation player, 2. Isaiah Stewart is a 2 rotation player. Poco, I can't say his name. I don't know. Is a 0. Josh Green, Dallas is a borderline. Sadiq Bey is a starter. He's played 8,000 minutes. Precious Achiuwa, 20th pick of that draft, is a 2. He's a rotation player. Tyrese Maxey, 21, is a 7 for a top 20 player. So you get the concept. And if you take that draft all the way, Jaden McDaniels a top 50, Desmond Bane I have as a top 50, now as a top 20. Okay, so that's the way the thing works. And I've done that for every pick for the last 14 years. So for those of you that are watching on YouTube, those of you on audio, I think I will be able to do this in a manner that will not impact you badly. So I think you're fine. You actually can now see the chart here. It's pretty small, frankly, for you to be able to see it. So let's go by pick for a second. Let's start with the first question here is, does your draft pick matter? And the answer is yes. Absolutely. Draft position matters. And if you go through the first pick of the draft, averages 5.2. Okay, so that averages a top 50 player. The third pick of the draft averages 5.5. Luka and a few others where they were a better pick at the third pick than the second pick. And the second pick, interestingly, averages 2.7, which is between a starter and a rotation player. The fourth pick averages 3.4, which is above starter level. The fifth pick averages 2.9. The sixth pick averages 2.0. The seventh pick averages 3.4. The eighth pick, for whatever reason, is a 1.2. Borderline to rotation, the eighth pick. So hopefully we slide out of that. Not that much. The ninth pick is a 2.6. The 10th pick is a 2.3. The 11th pick actually is a 3.2. I've always thought this is an interesting phenomenon. 11, 12, and 13 always do well in the draft. And what I think it is people are they stop shooting for the moon. When you have a top 10 pick, you feel a pressure that you've got to kind of shoot the moon. And when you end up trying to shoot the moon, you end up risking and going too far, and you end up not having, you end up missing. And when you go and take 10, 11, and 12, it kind of calms down a little bit. Picks 1 through 5 average over the last 14 years, 3.9. So picks 1 through 5 average right between a starter and a top 50 player. Picks 6 through 10 average 2.3. A little bit below the difference between a rotation player and a starter. Interestingly, picks 11 through 15 average the exact same. 2.3, 2.4. They average the exact same. And then at 15, we fall off a map. At 15, an NBA draft falls off the map. 15 through 20, average pick, 15 through 20 is a 1.1. No pick is higher average than a 1.8 in that stretch. The picks 21 through 25, average a 1.1 with no pick average being higher than 1.3. 1.1 is a borderline player. And the final picks, 26 through 30, average a 1.2. 1 is a borderline player. 10 points is a super MVP. 7 points is top 20. 5 points is top 50. 3 starter, 2 rotation, 1 borderline. After the 15th pick of a draft, it just falls off the map. Frankly, after the 10th pick of the draft, 135 players in the last 14 drafts, I think we have here, is what I think we came up with. 135, so 10 per draft. After the 10th pick, do not become rotation players in the NBA. Become zeros. Virtually 50% of all picks after the 11th pick of a draft become a zero. So you draft Walker Kessler at 24 and he becomes a rotation player. That is a win. You draft Bryce Sensabaugh at 29 and the chances are you're getting a borderline rotation player is what the odds are. Anything better than that, you get a win. You draft Keontae George at 16. He's on the wrong side of that. That's an average pick at 16 is a 1.1, a borderline player. You're on the wrong side of where this thing dives. If you're watching on YouTube, there's like I did the little thing you can do on Excel where you do the colors and green is good and red is bad. And we hit the 16th pick of a draft and it turns red. And there are only two picks after the 16th pick of a draft that average better than 1.5. So that means average more likely a rotation player than a borderline player. The draft is hard. So that's the first part of it. What does a pick really yield? So yes, draft position matters. The lottery on whatever May 11th really matters. If we can get into the top 4, that really matters. But this is a bad draft, I keep hearing. So what does it mean? I've graded each of these drafts by a number, which is what they yielded over the years. You can and look at that. The best draft and the worst draft are pretty divergent. But let's look at what those are, how they matter, and what we see here and get an idea of if this is in fact is a bad draft. What does a bad draft really mean? That's next as we're just getting started here on Locked On Jazz. Today's edition of Locked On Jazz is brought to you by my good friends over at Murdoch Hyundai, located at 4646 South State Street, also located in Logan and in Linden. Such a great lineup of cars, such a great family, the Murdochs. Over 80 plus years in Utah, and the Murdochs have made sure that they have the no regrets experience for you. What does that mean? That means they want to make sure that you have a perfect experience. But let me tell you, there's only 6 days left in the 2024 Palisade sales. It's a $3,000 off the Palisade, and there's only 6 days left. And the Palisade is amazing. The Palisade is the big of the SUVs. The next beautiful is the Santa Fe and the Tucsons. And now the brand new Santa Cruz is out, taking the world by storm. But the Palisade is the king poobah of them all. Absolutely beautiful. 6 days only, 2024 Palisade Limited, up to $3,000 off. If you're going to stop by Murdoch Hyundai, feel free to email me first at dlock09@gmail.com so we can make sure we give you the VIP experience that you deserve. Today's show is also brought to you by LinkedIn. Oh, thank goodness for LinkedIn as a still, luckily enough, even though we're part of a big corporation now, we still run as a small business owner. And hiring, it takes a lot of time. And LinkedIn is not just a job board. It helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else. Even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to a perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. 86% of small businesses get qualified candidates within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows small businesses, knows you're wearing many hats, knows you need help. So 2.5 small businesses are using LinkedIn for a reason. 2.5 million. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. We're just getting started on Locked On Jazz today. If you are a NFL draft fan, on Locked On NFL YouTube, we did quick little breakdowns with every single of our local experts and our national experts after every pick of the draft last night. If you want to recap what happened in the first round and you're a draft fan, that's available for you on Locked On NFL right now on YouTube. Also available for you, Locked On Sports Today on Amazon Fire. All sorts of great places for Locked On. All right, so now, what's a bad draft? There's definitely a concept that there is such a thing. So if we look over the years, the best two drafts that I found in the 14 years, three drafts, were drafts that had 77 or 76 points. Okay. So you total up the point total, 10 for an MVP, what we talked about earlier, 10 for an MVP, right? All the things we talked about. 10 for MVP, 7 for a rotation, a top 25 for a top 50, 3 for a starter, 2 for rotation, 1 for borderline. That's really the methodology here, is weighing certain successes more than others, because that's really what the league is all about. If you watched last night, Joel Embiid, Nikola Jokic, frankly, Anthony Davis was pretty great. Like, stars matter. 10s matter. You have to have 10s. So if we look at the 2018 draft, just to give you an idea of what turned out to be a very, very good draft, that's Luka Doncic. That's ironically enough, it's not very good on top. It's Luka Doncic. It's Jaren Jackson, who's a top 50. Trae Young, who's a top 50. It's Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who's an MVP. It's Mikal Bridges, who's a top 50. It's Michael Porter Jr., who's a top 50. Boy, was he ever last night. And that's 77. It's pretty top-heavy draft. 8 players turned out to be zeros. 7 of the final 20 turned out to be zeros. And it's a top-heavy draft in the fact that it's 37 to 77 come in the top 10. The next year's draft, the 2017 draft, was also very good. That's, again, Markelle Fultz busts with the number 1 pick, but this is why the 3rd pick is better. Jason Tatum is a 10. Josh Jackson's a 0 with a 4. De'Aaron Fox is a top 50. Lauri Markkanen's De'Aaron Fox top 20. Lauri Markkanen's a top 50. Donovan Mitchell's an MVP. Bam Adebayo's a top 20. So it's that middle of the draft that carries it, and it comes up with a 76. And it has 12 zeros in it. 10 of them, even a good draft, 10 of the final 20 picks turned out to be zeros. Now let's go to the one other there's 2 others, but one other is the 2008 draft. And I would argue in the recent years, if someone's talking about good drafts, 2008 is as good a draft as you can get in a draft. That's the 2008 draft, and the ones we just talked about are the best drafts that are there. So 2008 draft on a positive, staying on the positive, that's the number 1 pick, Derrick Rose. I gave him a 10. He won an MVP. Then Russell Westbrook's a 10. He won an MVP. Kevin Love is a 7. Danilo Gallinari was good, was a 5. Brook Lopez is a top 50 player. And that one actually just has great depth to it. It really holds for a long, long time. And it has 77. And that's interesting about that draft is only 7 players are 0, only 6 of the bottom 20 in the final 4 of the pick. But there's a lot of starters kind of in the middle of that draft for a long time in 2008. Now, what's a bad draft? Everyone says that this year is a bad draft. So we look at the chart, and the lowest draft number we have in any draft is a 49, a 44, a 49, and a 45. So let's go look at those drafts for a second and try to figure out, like, what if this is supposedly such a bad draft? So the first thing, and this system, this methodology does equate for the fact that, what they're saying about this year's draft is there's no Victor Wembanyama that's a 10. And so it's going to be hard for this draft to match up its numbers. In the 2012, in the worst draft that we've had in 13 years, the 2010 draft, there was not a single 10 player. There was only 1 top 20 player and only 1 top 50 player. So that there's a real chance that that's what we have in this draft. It would, if the 2010 draft, which is probably the worst draft we have, John Wall's the first pick of that draft, Evan Turner, Derek Favors, Wesley Johnson, DeMarcus Cousins. Is that right? I didn't give DeMarcus Cousins enough love, if that's the case. DeMarcus Cousins was probably a top 50 player, despite the fact he was detrimental. Epe Udo, Greg Monroe, Al Farouk Aminu, and then Gordon Hayward at 9 gets to be a top 50 player. Paul George is a top 20 player. Those are the only two top 10 and top 20 players in that entire draft. That draft has 12 players of the bottom 20 don't become zeros. And that draft has 30 of its 45 points in the top 10. So from picks 10 through 20, there was only one other starter. That's a horrific draft. Eric Bledsoe being that other starter. So you want the nightmare scenario for this year's draft. It's 2010. That's the worst. 45 points is the worst number that I have, I think, on any draft. And that is a bad draft. The other draft that's equally as bad numbers wise is 2012. And if that's really what we have this year, and that's a bad draft, that's a bad draft. 2012, we have Anthony Davis as the first pick, and he obviously is a 10. We also get Bradley Beal, who I put as a top 20, and we get Dame Lillard, who I put as a top 20. So the problem on this draft is it's entirely top heavy, which doesn't feel like what we have this year. 39 of the 45 points this draft got, and it's all came in the top 10. 16 of the final 20 picks get a 0. So there's two different styles of bad drafts. There's the 2010 bad draft that we just talked about, where there's just no star power. There's just a lot of players, and a lot of them don't. The 2012 draft is actually the one that's terrifying to me. Literally starting at the 12th pick of the draft, only 2 more players ever became rotation players in the draft after the 12th pick of the draft. In the 2012 NBA draft. Here's the run. Kendall Marshall, John Henson, Mo Harkless rotation, Royce White, Tyler Zeller, Terrence Jones, Andrew Nicholson, Evan Fournier rotation, Jared Sullinger, Fab Mello, John Jenkins, Jared Cunningham, Tony Roten, Miles Plumlee, Arnett Moultrie, Perry Jones, Marquise Teague, and Festus Ezeli. Like zeros across the board in that draft. If that's what we have this year, that's a disaster. Those are the two worst drafts. That's a bad draft. That I always say there's no bad draft. I take it back. 2012 is a bad draft. When you literally you only have 2 players after the 12th pick of the draft that are actually making and you frankly only had in that whole entire draft, because it was so top heavy, you only had 6 players that ever became starters that I classified as starters. 6 players. Now, one of them is Anthony Davis, who's a 10. Another's a Bradley Beal. Another's a Dame Lillard. Harrison Barnes, I put as a top 50. Terrence Ross and Andre Drummond. Drummond probably could have been a top 50 at some point in the league. He was pretty good for a while. I mean, that's it. That is a bad draft. If that's what we have right now, oh dear. And thank goodness we tanked. Or whatever we did to get to 8. The one other really bad draft here is 25th, most recently is 2015. So the 2015 draft is another one where it's just not a lot of play. This is what I think we have more this year than others. 12 zeros, which is not a high number. 9 of those zeros happen after the top 10, which is totally average. It's only a 49-point draft, and only 19 of them came early. So this is the draft I think we have. Karl Anthony Towns was the number 1 pick. He gets a 7 for a top 20 player. D'Angelo Russell's a starter. Jahlil Okafor bust. Kristaps Porzingis top 50 player. Mario Zingo bust. Willie Cauley-Stein bust. Emmanuel Mudiay bust. Stanley Johnson bust. Frank Kaminsky 0. Justice Winslow 0. But then it kind of clicked in. Miles Turner is a top 50 player. Trey Lyles is a rotation player. Devin Booker is a top 20 player. Cameron Payne, Kelly Oubre, Terry Rozier. Probably could have given Terry Rozier a starter. I gave him a rotation player. I wasn't surprised Miami played better when he wasn't there the other day, so that's probably why. So that's the draft I think we have here. Where it's totally flat. In other words, the draft got 49 points total, which is bad, right? The best drafts got 74, 77, 77 on our system. This draft got 49 points. It's bad, but only 19 of them in the top 10. So actually, the idea that there were 30 picks available from the bottom half of the draft is actually more than most of these drafts. Most drafts don't have 30, unless there's some big hit. So those are the way I'm looking. That's what a bad draft is. And one of those is pretty ugly if that's what we have this year. Leaf did a nice job yesterday giving us some hope on some of these guys and believing. But I look at like Dalton Knecht. Like I think he's a starter rotation player and he's going to be a top 10 pick. So it's kind of, I look at these drafts that don't have a lot up front, the 2015 draft and the 2013 draft have only 19, 20 points in their top 10 picks. To me, that's probably what we're dealing with in this draft. And then the question is, are there enough players along the way? To me, this actually changes the way you look at trades a little bit. And I'll touch on that when we continue next here on Locked On Jazz. As we continue, what the heck has just happened to my sheet? There we go, on Locked On Jazz. Today's edition of Locked On Jazz and the next episode is brought to you by our friends over at BetterHelp. BetterHelp is online therapy that is convenient. Therapy is not easy to be able to find the right person. Therapy is not easy to click. Therapy is not easy to schedule. Well, that's why, frankly, nothing in life is on those things. That's why BetterHelp becomes so valuable, because BetterHelp is convenient, flexible online therapy. In fact, I was talking to a friend yesterday who was like, what? I kept hearing BetterHelp on your show. And I said, what? Actually, I'm going to try it. And it's been like, I just had my first session today. I feel so great. That's the idea. It's performance enhancing. It's to make you feel better, to help you understand why you're having the reactions you are, why you're, dealing with what you're dealing with. Why are you in the same rut? Why are you acting in a way that you don't think is normal to who you are? All these things are legitimate. The one thing I really would share in that conversation, he was like, I kind of felt bad doing it because other people up here. Yeah, right. Great. You're self-aware enough that you're not a total jerk and you're aware of the fact that other people have other issues. It doesn't mean your issues aren't pertinent also. Yeah, other people have it worse. 100%. Probably true for every single person but one person on the planet, right? By definition. But it doesn't mean that your issues aren't worthy of being talked about or helped out or things of that nature. So BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA gets you 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. Convenient, flexible, online therapy. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. That's BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. Today's show is also brought to you by Nissan. Nissan's got 3 car lines for you right now to make things fun. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is the perfect city driver with great escapes. Class exclusive Google built-in is always updating your assistant. Gone are the days of connecting your phone, Google Assistant, Google Maps, or Google Play. The 2024 Rogue is perfect mid-size crossover. And the 2024 Pathfinder has room up to 8 with expansive cargo capacity, advanced available 4x4 capability with 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds of towing. When adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there. So whether it's the Rogue, the Pathfinder, or the Nissan Armada, the full-size SUV, get your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. If you have not checked out the Locked On Sports 24/7 channel, Locked On Sports Today, please do. If you're watching Fox or ESPN on your TV all day and you don't turn down the volume, don't want to be screamed at by anyone, Stephen A., or anyone else, Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube and free Amazon Fire TV app as well. Check it out today with the draft and everything going on and the NBA playoffs. This is when we're at our best. The local experts who really, really know what's going on. Plus, if you're an NFL expert fan, the Locked On NBA is Locked On NFL today with the whole rundown of all 30 picks is pretty outstanding. So check that out. All right, here's what I think's interesting, again, to what we've been talking about, is if we go look at the value of a pick. So let's take what I thought was the most interesting trade is this season was Masai Ujiri in Toronto trades OG Anuaoby, who is a top 50 player. So we would give him a 5, right? That's how, at least in this system, you are now embedded into this. would get a 5. He trades him for RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickly instead of for draft picks. And everyone's surprised, why didn't you do draft picks? Well, RJ Barrett to me is a 3, and Emmanuel Quickly is a 3 with a borderline being a top 50 if he keeps going. And so it seems like a great trade. And from New York's standpoint, by the way, New York puts in Miles McBride, who's turning out to be really good. He's either a 2 or a 3 over time and gets those minutes, and he's cheaper than Emmanuel Quickly. So their value was OG Anuaoby, which is a 5, plus Miles McBride, who gets the time, which makes him a 7, and they traded 6, right? 2 starters. That's a pretty great trade. What gets really interesting is trying to evaluate the Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell trades because they're obviously speculative. But let's say the Jazz don't get a single pick. This is what Minnesota's banking on, is that the Jazz don't get a single pick of the 5 inside the top 15. The Minnesota vows they're going to be good the whole time. Well, then the Jazz really got out of their picks 1.1 point value on any pick under 15. They got a 5. And Minnesota, plus then the Jazz got their Walker Kessler, which would be another pick possibility. So that's 6. And then the Jazz got the players, which they've parlayed into another pick, which is now 7, if none of them are in the top 15. And Minnesota got a 7 in Rudy Gobert, a top 20 player in the NBA. They got panned for this trade, but to some extent, it makes a lot of sense. And they got Nickeil Alexander-Walker in that trade. Oh, no, they got that in the Mike Conley trade. So, for them, they really get some. Now, the minute one of those Minnesota picks suddenly moves into the top 6 through 15, well, then the Jazz are getting 2 points per pick value. And now it's really different, right? Now it's a really different acquisition. Now it's the Jazz get 2 of their 5 picks, suddenly move into the top 6 to 15. Well, now it starts to skew. And if for some reason the Jazz get a top 5 pick out of it, then it really skews, right? And in the last pick of that draft, the last pick of that trade, when it's most likely the Jazz could get that, Minnesota protected themselves, I think, with top 3 protection. If we look at the Donovan Mitchell trade, it's even more interesting. I have Donovan as a 10. I think he's an MVP caliber player. The Jazz get Lauri Markkanen, which is a top 50. They didn't realize it at the time, and they get Colin Sexton, who's a starter. They got 8 points of value for Donovan even before they get a pick. And the Jazz, I believe, get 3 first-round picks and some pick swaps. The pick swaps could be, here's what's interesting also, if a pick swap, according to the charts, moves you from 16 through 30 to anywhere in the 6 through 15, then you're gaining a point. That's really valuable. The flip side, by the way, is if you look at the charts and you see how there's actually seems to be no value return more for the 20th pick than the 26th pick. There's an argument, you would never do this, but there is a mathematical argument if you're pick swapping below 16, you shouldn't pick swap, because it actually costs you more money for what's going to be an equal value player. How about that? Try chewing on that for a second. Do you make that make sense? So that if the 25th pick yields 1.1 and the 17th pick yields 1.1, you pick swap, you actually just pay more for the same value. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that because you believe you'll draft better 8 picks earlier. Everyone does. You're not going to do it, but the math says you should. The math says that the 18th pick is worth 0.9 and the 25th pick is worth 1.1. So therefore, you actually shouldn't pick swap that. How about that? Try selling that one to Ryan and Danny. Not a chance. So on the pick swaps, if you suddenly move out of the 16 to 30 range and can move yourself into anywhere between that 6 to 15 range, certainly that then gives you another value point. But the Donovan trade's interesting. So let's say Donovan's a 10. Let's say Lowry's a 3, just because that's what we thought he was. He's turned out to be more. That's how a trade works. So Lowry was a 3. Colin Sexton was a 3. You got 2 NBA starters. That's 6. You got 3 picks, each of which are probably, according to Cleveland's logic, is going to be 15 or below, each worth 1. That's 9. Donovan's worth 10. Those trades are pretty, Cleveland and Minnesota got kind of panned for making these trades. I think they gave up the right value. The risk they took was that if for something explodes and the Jazz end up with a top 15 or top 5 pick it's a problem for them. But frankly, if the Jazz don't end up with a top 5 pick on any of the Minnesota Cleveland deals, or they don't even end up with a top 15 pick, and we just talked about top 10 and below is a 50% chance of a rotation player, those were not bad trades by Cleveland and Minnesota. In fact, they'll probably come up on the positive side of the value. All right, hope that was of interest to you. It was really had to go do for while I was gone. Thank you very much to Leaf, who did a great job. I'll be back with you for most of next week, and then Leaf takes over Friday, and then I'm gone for a little while. And then we can have to spice Leaf in because he's just much better than I am coming into the draft. We'll do our pick numbers. I'll work on that this weekend and look at all the analysis of draft picks and who we like and who we don't by the numbers, like we've done, which has had a lot of success over the years. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed that one. I think that was an interesting way to look at the draft. I will talk to you soon. Hope you're great. Thank you very much for tuning in. Glad to be back in the saddle. And again, thanks to Leaf. He was absolutely fabulous. We now send you over to the first ever 24/7 national sports channel. It's called Locked On Sports Today. It's on YouTube. It's also on Amazon Fire TV. If you're on audio, please jump over and grab those and enjoy it. This is Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.